Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. My name is Magali Sunen. I work for the Flemish Ministry of Education and Training, and I have been the coordinator of the MICROBOL project during the last 2 years. I'm honored to be your host for this afternoon's conference. First, I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Anne Verhagen, Secretary General of the Department of Education and Training of the Flemish Government, for the welcome address.
Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. On behalf of the Flemish Ministry of Education and Training and our MICROBOL project partners, I would like to warmly welcome you to the final conference of the MICROBOL project. Micro-credentials are an emerging topic in higher education at the national and European level as well as globally. The topic is closely linked to the wider discussion on how to make lifelong learning opportunities more available, more accessible and more flexible. This way, we can better respond to societal challenges and keep pace with social, economic and technological changes. The COVID-19 pandemic has made the question even more urgent, as the need for upskilling and reskilling, as well as the importance of flexibility in the education and employment became ever more clear. Micro-credentials are a way to increase and diversify lifelong learning provision in order to support individual learning pathways and widen access to higher education. Learners seek more and more knowledge, skills and competences through short courses through non-formal or informal learning experiences. The student population also becomes more and more diverse, so innovative ways of learning like micro-credentials could offer flexible solutions. This is especially of interest to the underrepresented groups in higher education as well as to adult learners. The topics inclusion and flexibility have been high on our Flemish higher education policy agenda for many years. Together, they are the core of our higher education provision. But even then, our higher education system still has a lot of unsolved potential in terms of lifelong learning. Most of our flexible and inclusive provisions still have a main focus on young and full-time students. The momentum is there to support institutions to make their offerings more agile. In this momentum, the Flemish government decided to allocate European RRF funds to support the development of a strategy on lifelong learning in higher education, to be co-created by the government and the higher education institutions, and the implementation of future-oriented projects on lifelong learning, both of them including working with micro-credentials. Over the past 2 years, the MICROBOL project has engaged ministries and education and stakeholders involved in the Bologna follow-up group to explore whether or how the existing Bologna tools can be used or need to be adapted to be applicable to micro-credentials. We have tried to align the work at both national and European level during the time frame of the project and had regular contact with colleagues in other countries and at EU level. This project aimed to support knowledge about and enhance awareness of the importance of a common European format to document micro-credentials, create consensus about them, contribute to their implementation, and develop good practices. This is in line with the mandate of the EHEA Ministers of Education, who in the Rome communique asked to explore how and to what extent these smaller, flexible units, including those leading to micro-credentials, can be defined, developed, implemented and recognized by our institutions using EHEA tools. The final goal of the project was to propose a common European framework for micro-credentials in the European higher education area and based on the existing Bologna tools. We are proud to present this framework to you today. We have come a long way, but at the same time we realize that the outcomes of this project are still a beginning. We have to further cooperate in the coming years, exchange practices, learn from each other, and work towards the smooth integration of micro-credentials in our policies and in the classroom. But first, let us focus on the achievements of the MICROBOL project. I wish you a very interesting and fruitful event. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Mrs. Verhagen, for this welcome address. Now let us proceed with the agenda of the conference. And first, I will give you a presentation of the project, explaining to you what the project is really about and what activities we have done throughout the project. So as probably you all know, the title of the project is Micro-Credentials Linked to the Bologna Key Commitments. It is a project that was submitted through the Erasmus Plus KA3 funding of the European Commission in order to support the implementation of the European higher education area. The project ran from March 2020 to March this year, so we are now at the end of our project. The partners of the project are the Flemish Ministry of Education and Training of Belgium, who was the coordinator. And we did this together with Finland, with the Ministry of Education and Culture, Cimea from Italy, the EUA, and ENQA. Furthermore, we had a number of experts also contributing and sharing their expertise with us throughout the project. The aim of the project was, in the first place, to raise awareness among national governments. It was also the idea to encourage and guide those national governments to include micro-credentials on their policy agendas. We also wanted to check whether existing Bologna tools are fit for micro-credentials or if we needed to change or adapt some things on European level. In the end, we wanted to formulate recommendations and create a common framework for micro-credentials in the EHEA. We started the project, as I mentioned, in March 2020, and the first job that we did within the project timeline was performing a desk research. The desk research gave an input paper towards our kickoff conference in September 2020, and from that moment we also started to work in 3 working groups. The working groups worked since September, or starting from September 2020 until May 2021. And we had 3 working groups linked to those 3 key commitments of the Bologna process: quality assurance, recognition, and qualification frameworks and ECTS. As you can see on the slide, these were quite big working groups. We had a lot of participants in those groups, with about 32 to 34 countries represented in each group. In the meantime, we were also suffering from the corona pandemic, and we were having so many participants in those working groups. We decided to also try to take stock of what's going on, what was the state of play in all the EHEA countries concerning micro-credentials. Because in those big working groups, if you have online meetings, it's very difficult to really get an idea, get concrete information of all countries. So we conducted a survey in autumn 20, a survey among all EHEA countries. And those results of the survey were the starting point for further discussions in the working groups in springtime of 2021. Furthermore, out of these working groups, the recommendations were distilled and published in July. And the last half year of the project, we have been working on this European framework, which we are proud to present to you today on our final conference. Starting in our conference, at our kickoff conference, we also started from a working definition on what is a micro-credential. At that time, there was not really a definition yet at European level or at international level. There were some definitions used by other organizations worldwide, But we started to create our own definition of a micro-credential, and we said that it was a small volume of learning certified by a credential. And then we gave a whole explanation on how it can be used and what extra aspects should be known about this micro-credential. I will not go into further detail on the working definition right now, because it's also coming back in our framework that we want to present later on. I explained to you already about the MICROBOL survey. So the aim of the survey was really to gain a picture of the state of play of micro-credentials all over Europe. And also encourage the national discussion, because we sent out the survey to all members of the Bologna follow-up group and the members of the different working groups. And by having to fill out the survey, there was already some discussion going on also in the countries on how to react and which answers to fill into the survey. So in the end, 35 countries participated. And we really see that as a kind of reference point in time. I will also present you some results of the survey now, but please keep in mind that this is the state of play of autumn 2020. So in the meantime, a lot of things have proceeded, have developed. So it's really a starting point in time. Because it was really the first time that members of the EHEA were questioned about micro-credentials. And we can see it as a way forward in common understanding as well. Now, the survey had 3 sections. The first one was investigating the use of micro-credentials. So if we have a look at some graphs, we asked the countries if they are offering or if they were developing micro-credentials at that time. So we see that quite a lot of countries, 21 countries, were already offering micro-credentials in autumn 2020. 3 countries said that they were in development phase, and 8 countries responded that they were not offered yet at that moment. If we then had a closer look on the examples of these kind of micro-credentials, we saw a very diverse picture. Different kinds of micro-credentials and different kinds of activities and courses that could fall under our definition of a micro-credential, I must say. So they were separate course units, there were MOOCs, there were adult learning courses, so a very wide variety of examples. If we ask the countries about registers of records of micro-credentials and of providers, we see that most countries did not have a register of micro-credentials on offer, nor a register of providers. So we don't know at this moment if that has already changed, but at that time, the majority of the countries did not really have a record of neither the providers, neither the micro-credentials on offer. If we further looked at the regulation of micro-credentials at national level, we see a quite diverse picture. 22 countries said that micro-credentials were allowed and that they were regulated at national level. But only 8 of them said that they had specific regulations for micro-credentials. 14 said, well, they are allowed, but we don't have specific regulations for them. Some other countries said that it was still under discussion, and some other countries said that they were not offered yet or didn't have a regulation yet. The second section of our survey was really about the Bologna tools. We asked the countries if micro-credentials were included in their national qualification systems. And we see that really the majority of the countries said at that time that no, micro-credentials are not referred to in their QA processes in their country. But for quite a lot of countries, for 15 countries, they say it's not referred to explicitly, but implicitly they fall under the same QA system. If we then further asked about the sources of information on the QA status of the awarded credentials, we see a large majority of countries saying that the only information is through the provider, meaning through the higher education institutions. And a smaller number of countries said that they had this register or list of accredited micro-credentials on offer. If we go to the second key commitment, to recognition, we asked about the purpose to recognize micro-credentials in your higher education system. And there we see, well, a clear top three. So first one is to increase the learner's competitiveness in the labor market. On the second place is for academic purposes and for the recognition of credits or prior learning. So these were the main purposes in order to recognize micro-credentials. If we have a look at the recognition of micro-credentials offered by non-higher education providers, it's a more diverse picture. 18 countries mentioned at that time that only micro-credentials offered by higher education institutions could be recognized. In 16 countries, it was mentioned that they recognized micro-credentials offered by higher education institutions and also by other providers. If we then went to have a look at the third key commitment, the qualification frameworks, then we have received a whole diversity of answers. 10 countries mentioned that they are open to micro-credentials. But if we have a closer look, then we see a very diverse image. It can be at any level, it can be at levels 5, 6, 7, etc. So you can see it's a very diverse picture. And 9 countries also mentioned that only some examples of micro-credentials are referred to in their qualification framework. And also 15 countries said that there was no reference at this moment. If we have a look at the ECTS, it's also a very diverse picture. So we asked if the micro-credentials in the different countries were expressed in ECTS, and if yes, also what the amount of ECTS is for a micro-credential. So in many countries, the countries answered that micro-credentials are in some cases expressed in ECTS, but then the range is very broad, ranging from 2 to 6 ECTS in some countries, 1 to 60 ECTS in other countries. But we do see that the maximum is 60 ECTS. In a number of other countries, it's mentioned that the micro-credentials were always expressed in ECTS, but then if we also look further, more in detail, we also get this similar diverse picture. Let's then go to the stackability of micro-credentials. So can learners accumulate micro-credentials into a larger degree? 17 countries said yes, they can accumulate, leading to a full degree program in the end. But more or less the same number of countries said that they could not accumulate micro-credentials. So there is certainly still some work on this topic as well for the future. The last section of our survey was about the challenges regarding the application of Bologna tools to micro-credentials. If we ask what is the biggest challenge for countries, it's clearly that it's about the applicability of the tools to micro-credentials. So this is something that we will also see coming back in our recommendations about some further work on guiding documents in order to give more explanation about the applicability of the tools to micro-credentials. And what type of support is needed in the different countries? Well, mostly exchange of good practices, peer learning, training materials, webinars, etc. So we got a clear message from the working groups, but also from the survey, that there is still a need for further work and peer learning on micro-credentials. Now, as I explained to you while I was talking about the timeline, after the survey, the working groups had several meetings in spring 21. And out of these working groups, the MICROBOL recommendations were created. So those were based on the survey and on the discussions. So it led to a joint publication of 34 recommendations on QA recognition and qualification frameworks, as well as some general topics. The target for these recommendations are, of course, the countries of the European higher education area and the stakeholder organizations, but also the European Commission, as our recommendations have also been sent to the European Commission as part of their general consultation on micro-credentials. So I also give you here the link to our MICROBOL recommendations, which you can find on our website. So as I very briefly already touched, in the recommendations there are some general parts on transversal themes like the common format, the understanding on micro-credentials, the legislation, digitalization, and also some recommendations on the peer learning and support. And of course, a big part of the recommendations is about the Bologna key commitments. I will not go into detail on this right now, because later on some of my colleagues will have some presentations more in detail about these 3 Bologna key commitments. So I will close here now concerning the presentation of the project, and now I would like to invite the European Commission, Mrs. Kinga Sully from the Higher Education Unit of DG Education and Culture. So we will hear her presentation on the Council recommendation on a European approach for micro-credentials for lifelong learning and employability. Kinga, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Magali. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to briefly outline the Commission proposal for a country recommendation for a European approach on micro-credentials for lifelong learning and employability. The draft proposal was adopted in December 2021. Yes, here it is. The Council recommendation is a joint initiative for Commissioner Gabriel and Commissioner Schmidt. This initiative has been announced in the communication on achieving a European education area by 2025 and the Digital Education Action Plan, as well as in the skills agenda. It has both an education and a training dimension, as the title also shows, an employability perspective. This also covers both the lifelong learning aspects and the trainings. So the most important problems that are to be tackled by the initiative is related to upskilling and reskilling for the changing environment and the green and digital transition. It is really timely in the time of the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis because it has deeply affected the ways we live, learn, and work. More than ever, people need to learn, upskill, reskill throughout their lives, and this calls for providing them with more personalized and inclusive learning pathways. Micro-credentials are already in use across the EU. However, there are barriers to deliver on their full potential. What we see today is that the value of these micro-credentials is not always clear, notably due to lack of standards for quality and transparency. The Commission was conducting an extensive data gathering and analysis before making the proposal for this draft council recommendation. We had an open public consultation where we received more than 500 replies and 90 position papers. We also gathered empirical evidence from different organizations. And of course, the MICROBOL project was a very important source of information and a very important input to our consultation process. We also had a wide and targeted consultation with different stakeholder groups, including social partners and higher education institutions. The objectives of the recommendation is to enable people to acquire knowledge, skills, competencies in the changing labor market situation, to support providers to offer micro-credentials, and to ensure uptake of micro-credentials. It also fosters inclusiveness and equal opportunities. The scope of the draft council recommendations covers institutions, public and private providers in the EU. It helps all kinds of short learning opportunities, so it's not specified what kind of micro-credentials are covered by the initiative. It's very important that it's not the goal of this draft council recommendation to have micro-credentials replacing full qualifications. And the main objective is to support quality, transparency, and uptake of micro-credentials. So what is in the proposal? It has three main elements. It has building blocks of the European approach, namely a common definition of micro-credentials, the EU standard elements to describe micro-credentials and guiding principles for the design and issuance of micro-credentials. The proposal also addresses a number of recommendations to member states to develop an ecosystem for micro-credentials and to deliver on their potential with two main focuses that are education, training and skills policies, and active labor market policies. The proposal also contains recommendations to the Commission to support the work of the member states and the stakeholders to implement these recommendations. The draft proposal also outlines a common definition for micro-credentials. So according to the draft council recommendation, micro-credential means the record of the learning outcomes that a learner has acquired following a small volume of learning. These learning outcomes have been assessed against transparent and clearly defined standards. So courses leading to micro-credentials are designed to provide the learner with specific knowledge, skills and competencies that respond to societal, personal, cultural or labor market needs. Micro-credentials are owned by the learner, can be shared and are portable. They may be standalone or combined into larger credentials. They are underpinned by quality assurance following agreed standards in a relevant sector or area of activity. The standard elements that are proposed by the draft council recommendation to describe micro-credential, so the record of learning itself, covers a common format to describe the micro-credentials. It provides optional and mandatory elements. It supports the interoperability and portability of micro-credentials. And the record will be supported by an open standard to be developed by the Commission in consultation with member states and stakeholders through Europass. The principles for the microcredential design and issuance specify the nature of the microcredentials, offer guidance on the design and issuance of microcredentials, and may be used by member states, public authorities, and providers. They are universal and may be applied in any area or sector. The development of the ecosystem of the microcredentials will support formal learning. So microcredentials offered by higher education institutions and also for the European Universities Alliances will also support microcredentials offered by VET providers. It also provides incentives for non-formal and informal learning, promoting the development and the adaptation of the validation of the prior learning process. It is also covers recommendations how to improve the quality and transparency, how to apply, adapt, and develop quality assurance mechanisms for microcredentials, how to use the skills intelligence system to identify needs to develop or uptake of microcredentials. It aims to ensure that providers publish a catalog of microcredentials and also suggests to integrate microcredentials in national qualifications frameworks where relevant. To deliver on the potential of microcredentials, we expect that with the Council recommendations, we will address different skills challenges for active labor market policies. We also expect that in the field of education and training and skills policies, there will be a development to offer more and widely recognized and accepted microcredentials for digital skills and green skills. It will also contribute to the development of teachers and scholars according to our expectations, and it will also prompt transfer of latest research findings into learning opportunities. The Council recommendation asks member states to support the development of a European approach by defining measures on relevant national arrangements and financial frameworks, allocate national resources as appropriate, and link with the individual learning accounts. It also proposes member states to use the union funds to support reforms, enabling framework development and the use of microcredentials. And finally, the Council recommendation also provides different measures how the Commission can support the development of microcredentials. It proposes to develop and adapt, where relevant, existing union tools and services to support microcredentials by all types of providers, applying current EU and Bologna instruments in the field of higher education, develop guidance on how to include microcredentials in national qualifications frameworks, support the cooperation between member states and stakeholders, promoting European cooperation on quality assurance of microcredentials, facilitating cooperation projects among social partners on how to use and implement microcredentials to meet skills needs at European, national, local, and regional level and across the different sectors. It also provides measures to explore further development in the Europass platform to provide information on learning opportunities leading to microcredentials and providers that adhere to the European approach to microcredentials. support for the authentication of micro-credentials through European digital credentials for learning, support the portability, stackability, interoperability, exchange and sharing of information on micro-credentials through a European open standard, which specifies a common format for micro-credentials. And finally, supports further research and data collection on micro-credentials at union level. So this was from my side on the main aspects of the Council recommendation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kinga, too. And I would just like to invite everyone online who has any questions to please post them in the Q&A on your screen. You have an area just on the right-hand side where you can put out all your questions. We already had a few questions actually from the audience, and I'll just address some of them to you now. Regarding whether micro-credentials should be issued with a diploma supplement regardless of the size or credits of the studies. I would just like to bundle that with another question that came in, and another person asked whether there is a minimum to credits that a micro-credential should hold or should be the size, for example, 1 credit or 10 credits. And it would be great if you could share something on that, Kinga.
Yes, thank you very much. In relation to the minimum credit requirements for micro-credentials, currently there are different practice at different member states where micro-credentials are already a practice or even included in the national qualifications frameworks. In some countries there is a minimum requirement, in some countries there is a maximum requirement for micro-credentials. So that's why we opted for a solution which is open, and the only thing that specifies is that micro-credentials are smaller than a full degree. So we didn't propose a specific range for credits for micro-credentials.
Thank you very much. Just another question we also got in from the public that I'm sure you could answer. Someone asked, do micro-credentials only apply to academic higher education programs or also TVET or technical vocational education and training? If you could say a few words about that.
Our draft Council recommendation covers both. So it covers higher education and other institutional providers, so CVET and other VET providers, and also private providers. So it encompasses the whole range of providers of micro-credentials.
That fits nicely into another question that I just got in from the public. How should quality assurance be organized for private providers? Do you have any ideas on that from the Commission side?
Yes, it's very important to keep the flexibility for micro-credentials offered by private providers. So we didn't propose a compulsory full quality assurance system for private providers. It's up to the private provider whether they would like to include a full quality assurance system when micro-credentials is applied. But it's also very important to keep the high quality of these micro-credentials. So currently there are different kinds of discussions how to best approach this. For example, there is a possibility to link the quality assurance to the provider. So the provider could acquire a quality assurance mechanism itself, and then they can issue a micro-credentials which is in line with the European approach.
Thank you. Just another question that came back in regarding the diploma supplement. There are some people who would like to know a little bit more about it. If you could just elaborate from the Commission side, what do you believe should a diploma supplement be issued for micro-credentialed, and what form or what are your ideas about it?
Yes, so the diploma supplement is linked to full qualification currently. We are currently in the beginning of the procedure to discuss this draft Council recommendation. Of course, it would be important to increase the transparency of micro-credentials with also providing more information on this when a student finishes a micro-credential. The diploma supplement could be one way where this could be outlined, but it is the diploma supplement is linked to higher education and full qualification, so it is just an option.
Thank you. And just to further go on with some questions, when the proposal states that the ECTS credits, whenever possible, is a mandatory element, does this mean that this is always expected in the case of higher education institutions? So that's actually a question, does it always apply to higher education institutions in your view? In terms of micro-credentials, of course.
The ECTS credits are very important transparency tools for learning in higher education. It shows the learning outcome of the workload. It shows the workload of the learning during higher education studies. So for European approach for micro-credentials, it is very important to provide this information for the micro-credentials. So absolutely, this is an important element for higher education providers.
And then a little bit more of a let's say, general question, or like a broader question. Someone asks, how does the framework for micro-credentials link to the recently published European strategy for universities and its different action lines? I'm thinking that the framework is, of course, the MICROBOL framework, but we should probably rather look at the recommendation from the Commission side, and how these different Commission documents all link together.
Yes, so the European Strategy for Universities was adopted, it's a Commission communication adopted in January 2022. It also links with several actions to micro-credentials. So it also has one of the priorities, digital and green transition, where the application of micro-credentials to have this priority is a key element. So it links very closely together. The strategy also encompasses the most important elements for this Council recommendation.
Thank you very much. Well, we have a very limited audience here today, of course, as we're just in a room with the speakers of today's conference. We would just like to give one or two of them the floor for a brief question. They won't get into view, but they do have the audio normally, so you should be able to hear them. Please, Maria Kello, a question is yours.
Yes, now it is. Good. Thank you, Kinga, for your great presentation. It's a very good framework to have. What are your expectations as Commission towards the European Universities Initiative alliances in relation to micro-credentials, and how do you see that develop in the next rounds of the call?
Thank you very much, Maria. Absolutely, the European University Alliances are already developing micro-credentials, so most of them has already micro-credentials that are offered within these alliances. So it's a very important and flexible way to offer upskilling and reskilling opportunities. So the current alliances are already providing this, and we expect that this will be the case later. So, so many of the alliances already believe that offering micro-credentials for different kind of short learning options is a big opportunity for them to open up for different student audiences. So for bringing people back to higher education, for example, after their education has finished. So yes, indeed, it's expected that this will continue.
And maybe just to round it off with a final question for now, as I know we're bumping you with many, many questions. Just some questions from the audience still online. How do you foresee the implementation phase on a country and institutional level to ensure a broad understanding of the concept of micro-credentials, which to many countries is still fairly new? And I'd like to connect that to another question, also specifically regarding the job market and how micro-credentials are perceived there. So a quite broad question, I understand, but how do you foresee that further implementation uptake across Europe?
Yes, so this is a draft council recommendation currently, so there will be negotiations still with representatives of member states so that the council can adopt this council recommendation. After that, we will start implementation phase of the council recommendation. So we will work together with member states to start developing micro-credentials and start the European approach for micro-credentials. From the Commission side, as I also outlined in my presentation, we will provide different tools for the implementation, credit assistance, the Europass, financial opportunities for member states. So we hope that this will boost implementation, and we will quickly have the European approach adopted. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry. Oh yes, the job market. As this council recommendation is joined with the individual learning accounts council recommendation, we will also work together on the implementation, and we believe that this will be a significant positive response from the job market on that. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Kinga, for answering the many questions from the audience, and of course for also presenting to us the Council recommendation on European approach to micro-credentials for lifelong learning and employability. Now I would like to propose to you our common framework from the side of the MICROBOL project. Of course, we have not been working completely separately from what the Commission and within the EU is going on. During the MICROBOL project, we have had a lot of collaboration and discussion among the work in the EHEA through the project, and also the developments of the European Commission and the framework, the approach that was just presented to you. It's therefore important that we try to align both processes. They shouldn't be exactly the same, but at least they should not be conflicting in any way. And I also don't think that they are at this moment. So I'm now about to present to you the outcomes of our project with regards to the framework. And I would like to start with the common definition that we came up with during the project. So as I mentioned in the first presentation of the project earlier on in this conference, we started off with a working definition. This was already a definition of summer 2020. So in the meantime, of course, there has been a lot more discussion. It has been on all policy agendas during the last 2 years. So also within the project, our view on things have changed a little bit. What we really see as a definition of a micro-credential is a very short sentence. We say that a micro-credential is a certified small volume of learning. And there are a few words that are very important there for us. And not only for us as project partners, but what came generally out of all the discussions that we had in the working groups with many countries and stakeholders in the EHEA. So what is important is certified and learning. So what we, from the start, found very important is that there are two aspects. On one hand, the certificate, the paper, or the digital paper that you get in the end, the diploma, and on the other hand, the learning experience. And we feel that in a definition of a micro-credential, both are equally important. So we say it's a learning experience certified by a credential. So you get a certificate after you have a certain learning experience. What was also important in our discussion is the small volume. There has been a lot of discussion whether it should be the term small or short. We always kept to the terminology of a small volume because we think that it's really about the learning outcomes that a student acquires following a learning experience. So it's really about this small volume of learning experience, of learning outcomes, and then getting a certificate after that. So that's really important for us. And that is based on the learning outcomes. The success of such a European approach to micro-credentials also depends on its common understanding, but we must also agree on the purpose, the use, and certain constitutive elements in the certification itself to assure fair and transparent recognition and permeability between national systems, between higher education institutions and the labor market. So therefore, we also put forward a certain purpose. Why are we doing this? Why do we have micro-credentials? Well, we say that micro-credentials are designed to provide the learner with specific knowledge, skills, and competences that respond to societal, personal, cultural, and labor market needs. So it's quite a long sentence, and it has a lot of elements in there. So it's knowledge, skills, and competences, and it's linked to certain needs in the society. It's a way to increase and diversify the lifelong learning provision in order to support individual learning pathways and widen access to higher education. So this is also important. It's really seen in the framework of lifelong learning, and through the fact if you're offering micro-credentials, you can also address and attract other groups of learners that would normally maybe not go into higher education. We also say that micro-credentials provide a timely and relevant response to learners and labor market needs. And that does not mean that micro-credentials are something new. Maybe the terminology is new. But we think that micro-credentials are maybe things, kind of learning experience that have always been there. Courses, modules, diplomas, parts of degrees, in-service training, etc. So we, as I also showed you from the results of the survey, we have a whole variety of different kinds of courses that can fall under the definition of a micro-credential, and that can help in this lifelong learning framework. We also state that collaboration is a very important aspect for the provision of micro-credentials. And not only between higher education institutions, but also with other stakeholders, with NGOs, with labor market, with colleagues, organizations, institutions, nationally, but also internationally. Higher education institutions may also offer, sorry, I'm too quick now. Higher education institutions may also offer micro-credentials for different reasons. To a large extent, their offer is a way to respond to the needs of the society and and that way be a part of the institutional societal mission. But other motivations for offering micro-credentials also include the increasing the institution's visibility, for example, and the reputation by widening their geographical reach and also by attracting more diverse groups of students. They respond to the labor market demands, and they can also experiment through micro-credentials with new pedagogies and technologies. And as I said, there's a large variety of collaboration between all different actors involved in micro-credentials. And this collaboration also ensures that micro-credentials are relevant for the learners and for the labor market. Now, if we go and have a look at the use, we put forward that credentials are owned by the learner, are portable, and may be combined into larger credentials or qualifications. So this is our basic idea about the use of micro-credentials. They can be earned before, during, or after higher education degrees, and as a new way to certify competences acquired earlier in life. So they can really be like a first experience of higher education, or who wish to reskill, upskill, enhance, or seek acknowledgement for their knowledge, skills, and competences after a period in or out of the workforce. They should not be a goal in themselves, but they are at the service of educational and professional development of individuals. And the learners are always at the heart of micro-credentials. That's a very important statement to start from. We also say that catalogs of existing micro-credentials can be an important source of information for learners. They can help them to navigate through the diverse offer across Europe. They should be understood as repositories of data and information on existing micro-credentials and also on their trusted providers. Catalogs, they could aggregate information from different providers at different levels, regional, national, European, international, sectoral, etc. And they could also include information on the accumulation, the stackability of credentials. It's therefore also important that the certificates for micro-credentials can be awarded in many formats, but should be ideally in a digital format. Because digital and digitally signed micro-credentials can facilitate portability, but also transparency, reliability of information, and verification of authenticity. And that's a way to enhance the fast and fair recognition process and facilitate also the stackability of these micro-credentials. And then we come to the stackability. So stackability, it really means that different micro-credentials can be combined into a degree or another type of certification. And that's something that is already possible in a small number of European countries, but certainly not in all members of the EHEA. And that's something that we can further work on in the coming years. What is also important is that we have a look at micro-credentials and the funding mechanisms in our higher education. We think it will be necessary to consider the costs of developing and delivering micro-credentials across different disciplines, and also have a look at how they are linked to higher education funding structures. Because every country, every member has now, of course, their own national funding schemes, but often the lifelong learning provision is not really a part of it, or has a different funding mechanism. So if we look at the whole picture of getting more flexible learning paths, more individual learning paths throughout higher education, and also incorporating this lifelong learning provision through micro-credentials, it will be necessary to have a close look at our funding systems and see how we need maybe to make some changes into that. And what is also important is the link between education and research. Micro-credentials can facilitate a smooth knowledge transfer, translating the latest research results very quickly into learning opportunities for the benefit of society. So also when developing or making national regulations also on micro-credentials, it's important that we try to be as flexible as possible in order to allow for this rapid and fast response to the labor market needs and to changes in research, for example, to be able to translate that easily and fast into micro-credentials. So in the end, we see really micro-credentials as a way to tailor the learning offer and to make visible knowledge, skills, and competences acquired. Last but not least, we have set up a number of constitutive elements. So on this micro-credential certificate, what do we need to know about the learner, about the provider, etc.? What should be there? So we have first the information on the learner, the identification of the learner. Of course, we need information on the certificate about who has taken the learning experience, etc., the name of the person, well, the real identification of the learner. Next to that, we also need information on the provider, including the country, information on the awarding body institution, including a signature or seal of the provider and or from the awarding body institution, because the awarding body is not always the same as, or can in some cases not be the same as the provider. So it's very important that we also get information on the provider. And that's, of course, very similar to regular degrees. Of course, we also need the seal and the signature of the higher education institution in case of regular degree programs. So that's quite similar. Furthermore, we need information on the micro-credential itself. What's the title of the course of the learning experience? What's the date of issue, the date of the assessment, the verification of authenticity? And next to that, we need information on the learning experience itself. What learning outcomes have been achieved? What is the workload, preferably in ECTS, of course, if possible, because that's also something important that maybe I didn't tell you before. Because in the MICROBOL project, we really focused on higher education only. We know that for the framework that the Commission presented, it's much broader, but really in MICROBOL, we stick to higher education institutions or micro-credentials that are recognized by higher education institutions. So it's always a link with higher education. So for us, it's quite logical that we would assume that the workload is also mentioned in ECTS. Furthermore, on the information of the learning experience, we need information on the assessment and also, of course, on the form of quality assurance in order to facilitate also the recognition. Furthermore, we need information about the qualification frameworks level. Information about how the micro-credential is taken up in the national qualification framework, in the EHEA qualification framework and EQF level, and if possible, also information on the ISCET level and the subject area codes and the SQF level, if needed. My colleague will later on in the separate presentations on the different key commitments go further into detail on this. Furthermore, we also thought it would be important to have information on the form of participation in the learning activity and about the access requirements to be able to subscribe for this micro-credential. So these are really the constitutive elements that we put forward through the MICROBOL project. And if you have them next to each other with the elements that were proposed by the European Commission, you will see that there is a very big overlap. There is really not any conflict on this. I think we just mainly grouped the information a little bit different, but there is certainly no conflict between both frameworks. And such a common format is also really necessary for providers to document the micro-credentials and their value. So that's really why we put forward also these elements next to our definition, purpose, and use. Of course, oh, now I'm too far. Of course, this is only a part of our framework. If you have a look at the framework, which is already online on our website, you can have already a closer look. You will find there much more information also on quality assurance, on recognition, and on qualification frameworks and ECTS. But those will be tackled in the presentations after our health break. So if I look at the clock, we are 5 minutes ahead of schedule, which is, of course, no problem. Then you will have 5 minutes longer health break. So we will not have any questions right now on the framework because we will have questions later on in the program after the presentations of the 3 Bologna key commitments. And of course, we also still have a panel discussion with you, with some experts who worked with us in the MICROBOL project. And of course, also then we will take a lot of questions on the framework and our recommendations. And also of course, on the way forward during the panel discussion. So keep your questions for now. I wish you a very healthy break, and we will meet again here in our virtual and for us physical auditorium in Brussels. Thank you very much, and I'll see you back at 3:15 Brussels time. Thank you very much.